Thank you. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our latest IBOR discussion session. My name's Guy Usher, for those that don't know me, and I'm co-head of financial markets and products at Fieldfisher. Today we're going to run it as a panel session for you, rather than just a series of talks. We've got a broad collection of panelists. I'll introduce them in a minute. Not all lawyers, you'd be pleased to know. They are all correctly working from home, unlike me, who's conveniently placed in air conditioning at our office in Riverbank House. So that's why you'll see me looking slightly different. So before I introduce the panel, as I said or announced, the thing is just for people to be able to assess, where they are relative to their peers and just some of the things that their peers are still grappling with. I'd just like Chloe to explain how this works for those who perhaps haven't used this webinar facility. Chloe?
Yep, thanks Guy, and thank you everyone for joining the update today. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you do have any questions for any of our panelists today, please use the question/chat box in your control panel, and this can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll aim to get through as many of these as possible, but if we don't have time to answer all of your questions, then our team will follow up individually. Additionally, we will be using polling throughout the discussion, and you will be able to view the polls in your viewer pane once launched. Once you've selected your answer, please click submit, and we will then share the results in real time. Finally, should you have any technical questions or issues throughout, please do use your questions drop down and one of our technical team will assist. Back to you, Guy.
Thanks, Chloe. Right, let me just briefly introduce the panel we've got here today. I'll take them in the order they should appear on screen. First of all, you've got Stephen Burrows. Stephen is a senior lawyer in our financial regulatory group with a focus on derivatives and financial markets. Before qualifying as a lawyer, Steve was a rates trader at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, so he's quite familiar with how these products work. Next along, we've got Hasib Haq. Hasib is the managing partner of our consulting division. Hasib's over 20 years of experience in product solutions, risk management and structuring in global investment banks, including Citi, Standard Chartered and Bank of America. And in the context of IBOR transition, he's been working with clients on impact analysis and risk management. Next to Hasib, you've got Ashwani Roy. Ashwani joined Hasib relatively recently. Hasib was a quant, solutions architect and machine learning expert at Citi before he joined Hasib. He's over 15 years of experience in mobilizing complex systems architecture. Next, down rather bottom row, you've got Richard Gibbard. Richard is a senior loans lawyer at Fieldfisher who supports our banking team on technical issues. And both Steve and Richard sit on our own IBORs working group as well as industry associations. So they keep us all, our lawyers and our clients, up to date on market developments. Lastly, we have second from last, we've got Saranjan Son. Saranjan is head of financial services at Hitachi Vantara Solutions in Europe. He's over 23 years of experience within the software and consulting industry. And again, he's involved in system upgrades and implementation. And then lastly, we've got Stephen Ingle, also on the bottom row. Stephen heads up our Condor Alternative Legal Solutions platform. He, before joining us, worked for Bank of New York Mellon, Deutsche Bank and others. And he's working on various projects to implement solutions for LIBOR discontinuance, covering a mixture of project management, document discovery, data extraction, and repapering. So as I said, we're going to run this as a sort of panel session with questions, and you may ask your own as we go, and at the end we'll pick up a number of those. And I've kind of structured it into various buckets. So we're going to start briefly on market developments and hand over to Richard initially to talk to us about where things stand in terms of banks effectively being able to issue non-LIBOR alternatives from Q4 this year, and also to stop issuing LIBOR sterling, at least from the end of Q1 next year. Perhaps, Richard, you could just tell us where things stand.
Sure, yeah. So those deadlines are the sort of soft deadlines in a sense, because the hard deadline is obviously the end of 2021, when we expect LIBOR to go away. But the sort of interim deadlines have actually been moved slightly due to the pandemic. However, the sort of issue there is the fact that we're still trying to move forward to get to a point where banks are not issuing, or lenders aren't issuing LIBOR-linked loans, just really so that they're not adding to the problem that already exists. And there's an issue, I suppose, in what is going to come first, whether it's going to be documentation that comes first, whether it's products that come first, or whether it's the systems. Now, really, all of those things have to develop in parallel. We have seen there's probably about a dozen or so risk-free rates, so SONIA or SAFRA or SARON loans that have actually been issued in the last 12 months or so. And the Loan Market Association have kindly sort of been gathering data on those, and they've sort of published a list of those deals that have been, certainly the ones that have been made publicly available. But these are really just sort of pilot transactions, pilot loans, just to see where the land lies, and a lot of the conventions for non-LIBOR loans are still being developed. They are starting to coalesce. We're starting to see certain trends and certain conventions come through now. So one of the big issues, of course, is the fact that a risk-free rate like SONIA is backward-looking, certainly for the time being. We'll talk about term rates shortly, but those sort of the mechanics that need to be put in place to allow loans to be calculated on a backward-looking basis are starting to settle down now. So we are seeing, for example, a sort of 5-day look-back period to set the rates, rather than your sort of getting your rate at the start of your interest period and things like that. But in terms of what people can do on origination now, then we are still certainly seeing, obviously, LIBOR loans go out of the door, and the requirement, certainly on the sterling side of things, is that the documents should now have these sort of contractual mechanisms to allow them to adapt to a new rate basis when they need to. So they need to have a trigger event, and they need to be able to, the parties need to come together to agree a new rate basis when LIBOR disappears. Now, there are two different ways of looking at that, and some of this differs across jurisdictions and currency bases. So, for example, in the UK, we are seeing more of a sort of flex or amendment-based approach. In the United States and with the US dollars, then there is a little bit more of a push towards a hardwired switchover. And that means sort of moving at a specific time to a specific rate, for example. That approach is not necessarily taken on over, in the UK and for sterling. However, it is starting to develop a bit more. And we are certainly seeing some more discussion around different trigger events, for example, as to when those rates will switch over, and some of the language that's going in will actually reflect a sort of known quantity. So you'll expect to see loans that will actually specifically pick out a new rate basis. But there isn't really much to sort of to get your teeth into here, because the number of transactions that have actually certainly been publicly being made available aren't really there for us to sort of gather any real market intelligence on. However, there is information that we can tap into, and like I say, there are definitely trends developing in a more sort of hardwired or more a more organized switchover than perhaps just a sort of consultation type arrangement, which is what we were seeing earlier on in the markets.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And Steve, what about in derivatives markets? Are derivatives markets moving at a pace that regulators are happy with?
Yeah, I mean, the general sense that I'm getting is that regulators are happy with the progress in the derivative markets, and I think it's fairly unambiguous that the derivatives markets are really leading the way for LIBOR transition. So the Bank of England, the risk-free rate working group for sterling, set a Q1 target for the market convention to shift away from LIBOR to risk-free rates. So market makers should consider RFR linked products as kind of the default position now rather than LIBOR linked products. And really, although that target was aimed primarily at the sterling market, I think the expectation has very much been that other markets should follow that timetable as well. And looking at it in that context, I think the sterling market has really met that Q1 target, but probably not other markets. Such as euros, dollars, Swiss, etc. So on the sterling side of things, I mean, SONIA is the successor to sterling LIBOR, and SONIA-linked swaps have been around for quite a long time now. So what we're seeing is that liquidity in SONIA-linked swaps has been steadily building. And in terms of volume, my understanding is that the trading volume in SONIA swaps is broadly comparable to sterling LIBOR-linked swaps. We've also seen 1 and 3 month SONIA futures are now trading on ICE in greater volumes. However, the downside to that is that whilst the volumes are building, it's really building in concentrated locations around the yield curve. And in particular, SONIA swap liquidity is concentrated primarily at the short end of the curve, so the 0 to 3 year tenors. And it's also coalescing around, the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee meeting date, which has traditionally been sort of the main use case for, SONIA-linked swaps, basically to trade expectations of interest rates out of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. So really, what we need to see now in sterling, at least, is for liquidity to broaden out across the curve, in particular for SONIA-linked swaps to be quoted out of spot rather than around the MPC meeting date, and that will then allow these term RFRs, so terms SONIA, for instance, to be derived from the derivatives markets. At the moment, it's not entirely clear that there's enough liquidity in the sterling markets to allow those term rates to be built on a reliable basis. The position in sort of the US and Euro markets is a bit different. With SOFR and ESTA being completely brand new rates that have only recently been created. And we are seeing SOFR futures are now trading on CME, and SOFR-linked swaps are also available, but the volumes have been quite low so far. There's not been any real catalyst to spark liquidity in trading in those markets. And it's sort of the similar position in Euro. There's no ESTA futures yet, I don't believe, and the swap volumes are quite sporadic, although now that Eonia is effectively pegged to ESTA, since Eonia's redefinition, I suppose you could in one way consider Eonia swaps to effectively be ESTA linked swaps. Having said that, now that CCPs are planning on switching over their discount rates and interest rates paid on cash collateral over to ESTA and later on in the year SOFR, there is a hope that there will be more of a demand for SOFR and ESTA linked products in order to hedge the interest rate risk associated with cleared derivative products. Where we are seeing a notably slower transition is in the Asian market, and I'm guessing that's partly because there's not the same regulatory pressure to transition their IBORs, such as HONYA in Hong Kong, for instance, onto RFR linked products instead. In some countries as well, there's a barrier to transition, particularly for instance, with the Singapore offered rate, because that itself is derived from US dollar LIBOR. So until the US position becomes a bit more settled, it's harder for those countries then to produce alternative rates that are completely standalone and independent.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Just whilst I've got you both, and perhaps you can start, Steve, whilst I've got you. The legislative solution, which is a relatively new UK development idea, and I know it's been kicked around in the US for longer, and there is a draft legislation, I believe. UK not quite got us that far, but where do you think that will take us?
Yeah, so I think before we just jump into that, just outlining what the two solutions are. So as you mentioned, you've got the US solution and the proposed UK solution. So they're both aimed at and do slightly different things. So it's important to understand the difference. So the US solution, driven out of the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARC, is aimed at New York law governed documents only. And its intention is to force a transition effectively onto a SOFR derived rate plus a spread in contracts that are silent contracts, so they don't have any particular fallbacks or alternative rates built into them already. So it's designed to address that kind of tough legacy where there's no contemplated fallback. The UK approach is effectively, it's designed to be an extension to the benchmarks regulation. So once the benchmarks regulation is onshored into the UK at the end of the Brexit implementation period that we're in, its powers, the powers afforded to the FCA will effectively be extended to allow the FCA to manage the orderly wind down of critical benchmarks such as LIBOR. And what that effectively does is it allows the FCA to effectively impose a different methodology on a critical benchmark where that benchmark has become unrepresentative and is not realistically capable of being restored to representativeness. So it's basically a way for the FCA to rewrite the methodology for LIBOR to something else to enable contracts without any fallbacks to continue functioning. The difference here is that the UK approach applies, will apply to the 5 major IBOR, so euro, sterling, dollars, yen, and Swiss LIBORs, whereas obviously the New York position is limited to New York documentation. I mean, on the derivative side of things, I mean, the UK approach and the US approach both aimed at the tough legacy category, and derivatives, generally speaking, won't or really shouldn't be in that category. The one exception to that really being sort of highly structured trades that have no realistic prospect of shifting to RFRs. Although there are some trades like swaptions and other kind of non-linear products that will need a more tailored solution. So from the derivatives market, I'm not sure it's a particularly groundbreaking solution that will suddenly fix all the the transition issues. I don't think it's intended to be that.
I think that the other thing that's worth talking about at this juncture is the potential role of a synthetic LIBOR, or I think it was variously described as sort of zombie LIBOR and things like that earlier on in the piece. But really the idea behind a sort of synthetic LIBOR or is to sort of patch the holes really in where contracts don't really have any other alternative, and it's really seen as sort of as an absolute backstop, a sort of last resort basis for as a benchmark rate, because the FCA have been quite clear on saying that something like a synthetic LIBOR will be an unrepresentative rate, and it's not something that they want to see used for new loans or anything like that. It's really something that is just there to sort of provide a complete backstop, and the methodology will be, I think it's still being looked into as to how that's going to work, but it's not something that is going to look like the rate landscape that we know at the moment. So I don't think anyone really should be in a position or should be looking to rely on a synthetic LIBOR as a and effectively sort of sit there and do nothing and say, well, that's what's going to take the place of my existing LIBOR rate. So yeah, I don't think that's something that we want to push in. It's going to come up, I suspect, on things like refinancings and, as we say, the sort of tough legacy contracts, which obviously impact on the loan market a little bit more so than derivatives, as Steve has already sort of suggested.
Thanks, Rich. I'm going to move us on now to our next bucket of questions. We may come back to some others, just about some of the issues that firms are grappling with, and after that we'll look at sort of planning and preparation and readiness. So, I mean, Ash and Saranjan, perhaps you could just talk to us a little bit about how the banks are dealing with potential economic value transfer as a result of the transition.
Yeah, sure.
I'll let you take this one, Ash.
Thanks, Randy. So we know so far that there's a difference between the two rates. One of them do not have a credit component to it. Apart from it to be a RFR being an overnight rate, the spread adjustment that you could, for instance, look at in a SONIA market is very different from what we are observing in the traded market, and hence the difference between this fallback versus the market traded implied spread adjustment is going to cause a P&L impact. The timing of the transition is also very important. And so what we have been trying to do is to work with our clients and really look at the inventory that they have to better understand for themselves and for their counterparties how they could essentially quantify this impact. And in one of those situations, we're working with Hitachi. So Saranjan, you want to talk about the risk simulator?
Yeah, so effectively being able to kind of generate the hypothetical scenarios associated with the switch, and look at what potential impact that has on specific contracts and the overall portfolio that you're holding. And this is something we've been working on for years in the core risk space, in the core kind of across several desks. But now we think that this is something that could be very useful in this particular scenario, and it can run almost like a parallel simulation engine that allows the banks to look at what's the potential impact of going from one regime to the other.
Yeah, and to add to that, there's in order to look at the impact on the portfolio, you can look at it in one go and account for the netting impacts of the floating rates that you might have. So such a strategy has sort of been useful where the inventory is large.
Yeah. So that's yeah, thanks, Ash. So that kind of moves on there. So that's obviously a bit of an issue for what the banks are doing. That they've also got, I think, concerns with their clients where they've got dislocation in their systems between like debt or loans and the swaps that they perhaps entered into. Do you want to just talk about some of those?
Absolutely, Guy. So one of the big problems that we have is systemic, that loan systems has been always different from the derivative systems, and a lot of banks have got these assets, the loans, and back-to-back hedges. Depending on the inventory that you have, for a bank of a very large sort of swaps and asset linkage, it's quite difficult to determine the precise linkage between the loans and the swap, and that is one of the scenarios that we have been trying to help, again from a valuations and systems perspective, where with what we have with Fieldfisher Condor, and on the Hitachi side, we have built this fuzzy matching tool that sort of allows you to upload the entire inventory of loans and derivatives and perform this kind of fuzzy matching on n number of parameters to be able to then automatically find which loan is linked to which derivative. And that is critical because any error between the two would lead to P&L and accounting impacts. You want to make sure that not only the transition is done with the same sort of spread adjustment, but also the timing and the other things that you took into account while sort of qualifying these hedges as a hedge accounting eligible hedges still holds. So that is something that we have been seeing quite a lot with larger banks who have large inventories and treasuries especially. So Anjan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, and Hasib, then, is that one of the concerns that the banks have been worrying about, conduct risk? You have been talking about this for years now, but...
No, absolutely. I think the regulators are very keen to make sure that the financial institutions do not take this up as an opportunity to make extra revenue, because each individual contract will need to be repriced. So first of all, I think the financial institutions have to work very, very hard to make sure that the clients are fully updated on the entire context and why there's a repricing, and they do understand the basis of the repricing and how that is going to be implemented. But more so when it comes to loans which are hedged, as Ash was saying, because it's absolutely critical that when you reprice, then the repricing mechanism both for the loans and the derivatives, they don't match, because you don't want to create a mismatch between the two. So it's absolutely critical in that space for the financial institutions to start talking to their clients today. One of the things that we have seen talking to our clients is there tends to be a slight difference in the approach in the transition. On the loans, people seem to be happy to take a back seat and rely on some sort of a fallback mechanism, whereas in the derivative market, there is an effort to negotiate this more proactively on a bilateral basis. So you cannot have a situation where you take one approach for the derivatives and a different approach on the loans, on the repricing especially, because that may create issues with the corporate clients, and that may have implications on the conduct risks, which regulators are really, really focused on, just to make sure that this does not become an incremental revenue making opportunity for the financial institutions.
Thanks, Hasib. Just we've talked a bit about banks. I'm conscious we've got a mixed audience today, or at least they had registered. Steve, what about the buy side? What are we seeing on buy side issues?
Yeah, sure. So on the regulated side of things, so your asset managers, etc., the FCA in February this year set out its expectations for such firms in a Dear CEO letter, and its expectations were essentially a mirror image of its expectations for sell-side firms. So where it has told sell-side firms to stop originating LIBOR-linked exposures, the flip side of that is then buy-side has been told to stop acquiring those exposures. And as the FCA expects firms with material LIBOR exposures to deal with this at a board level, appoint relevant senior managers to manage the transition and have proper governance frameworks in place. But what we're definitely seeing on both the regulated and the unregulated side of things for buy-side firms is that they are struggling with certain aspects of the transition, in particular around how the various ISDA solutions operate in the derivatives market. So how the new 2006 definition supplements work versus the benchmark supplement. How do you go about adjusting your collateral interest rate, etc.? What compensation mechanisms are available for transfers of value that arise as a result of these fallbacks, and also what their approach to remediation should be on this. And it doesn't help as well that there are other kind of side issues that are tangentially related to IBOR discontinuance, but are not squarely within its focus, such as CCP discounting switches, etc. The fact that Euribor is continuing, but Ionia is being discontinued, and the fact that the benchmarks regulation in the EU came into force around the same time as IBOR discontinuance was being kicked off, which has sort of confused the issue even more. Again, one of the main issues is how do you go about changing to new products, as no one wants to be the first to dive into a potentially illiquid RFR linked product, but at the same time you don't want to be the last one out of a LIBOR linked product as well. So there's difficulty there in finding suitable alternatives and analysing how they will fit into an overall investment policy or strategy. So I think what all this has led to is we've seen generally a more reactive kind of wait and see approach from from buy-side firms, and that there's a lot of reliance on bank counterparties to approach them to take the lead in helping them through the transition. Now, whilst bank counterparties will in general drive the documentary process, that's only one piece of the puzzle. Banks can't manage other aspects of the transition, such as the selection of alternative products, when to transition, how those products fit into your strategy and planning, management of conduct risk, governance risk, and compliance with regulatory and fiduciary duties to your clients. And also, it merits mention as well that taking a reactive approach ultimately could lead to you ending up in a bit of a crunch period where it's all been left a bit to the last minute, and then bank bandwidth has been constrained, and so it's difficult then to get the amendments that you need through the bank's documentary teams. So they're just some of the issues I think we've come across.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
And obviously the buy-side firms are they're not all just borrowers and so on. There's quite a lot of buy-side or non-bank lenders, and obviously there's even some of the regulated firms are life insurance companies, so major lenders in certain markets, particularly for long-dated products. Richard, what are you seeing there as the non-bank lender buy-side market?
I think the non-bank lenders, I think generally that it's worth saying that we're going to see more fragmentation of products. That I think for a long time people have obviously been used to a sort of single rate basis that everyone understands, and I think really now this sort of there's a nervousness around the repricing element, but also I think there's an uncertainty as to what the rate landscape will look like, and I think a lot of that is based on the fact that there are going to be different rates out there in the market. The idea that we've already heard really from the regulators is that any new rates that come in will need to be sort of transparent, appropriate and relevant to the buy side, to customers, that is, because you can't just sort of blanket say everything's going to switch over to a risk-free rate in arrears. It's got to be something that actually suits the market and suits the product. So that's a good thing really, because it would mean that there is going to be some leverage there, and there's choice. In terms of the sort of the legacy products, I think also particularly as regards repapering, customers are nervous, I suppose, about the cost of that. Traditionally, the cost of an amendment in a loan, for example, is a borrower cost. But this is really something that's not being driven by anything that a borrower necessarily needs to deal with. So the cost, I think, is probably going to, well, we've certainly seen discussions that it will be a shared cost, and also I think there's some discussion about this sort of how proactive you can be in this, and part of that will obviously relate to what trigger events you have in your documentation. Certainly the way the loan markets have gone in recent years in putting in the what we know as the sort of screen rate replacement events, the trigger events there are generally sort of seen as more sort of regulator driven, and sort of reactive, and there is perhaps less certainty in the document as to what point you can actually start to have these proactive discussions about pricing. So I would expect to see some thought about those trigger events, and I think that's something that we can perhaps talk about later in the piece.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Let's see, what about corporates before we move on to planning? Because this is the last question before we do that. What about just pure corporates?
Yeah, so we've spoken to quite a few corporates, especially in the emerging markets, and I think that the general approach there is that they're relying on their banks to come to them and guide them through the transition. That may not necessarily be the right approach, especially for the large corporates. There are a couple of issues that they need to consider. The most significant one that the clients have spoken to us is about the fact that RFR effectively sets in arrears, whereas corporates are used to knowing their exact cash outflow in terms of the interest payments 6 months or 3 months earlier. And therefore, if now they move on to a situation or regime where the bank is going to send them invoice towards the end of the interest period, that is going to change the way that they actually go about the cash flow planning and also the system. So, as Steve and Richard indicated earlier on in the seminar, there are certain solutions that have been contemplated upon. So, for example, 5-day observation. The question really is that 5-day observation period going to be sufficient for the corporates and the sovereigns? And do they really need to look at something like term rates? And this is not only a concern from the corporate's point of view, but also from the financial points of view, because the banks need to make sure that their clients have the capacity to be able to make those payments in time, and it does not get extended. So that's one critical element to this. The other one, Guy, obviously is the situation that we've already talked about, is where that you have a syndicated loan, which is then hedged for, let's say, interest rate swaps. For large corporates, what ends up happening is that the syndicated loan actually gets distributed to a large number of financial institutions, but the derivatives are typically done with one or two. In one specific situation, we had a client who had on one syndicate facility who had more than 10 banks as lenders, whereas only 2 banks that were providing a hedge on that loan. Therefore, trying to make sure that the timing of the transaction and the repricing of the derivatives and loans in those situations are absolutely critical from for the corporates. And then there obviously are some discussion on hedge accounting. So we're not accountants, but I think that is one consideration that the corporates will definitely need to discuss with their auditors. And the one peculiar situation that we've come across is a situation where the borrowers have a large floating rate loan on their books, but then they also have a pass-through mechanism with their regulators, where all the exposures to LIBOR is passed through to an off-taker, for example. And therefore, when there is a transition, it's not just a question of renegotiating their underlying loans, but also to make sure that those pass-through mechanism is maintained and is as effective as it is today.
Thanks, Haseeb. Chloe, can you run a couple of, give these guys a break for a few seconds? Can you run the first 2 poll questions for us, please?
Yeah, they're coming up now.
Well, hopefully you can see the questions. I'm not going to read them out, and actually I can't see them. So unlike the rest of you, I think you can now see questions. I'm sure you can read them for yourselves. You could just bear with us, click on one of those. I'll give you a minute, and then Chloe will magically reveal the answers. Okay, Chloe, make the magic happen.
Hopefully you can see those, and the other panelists should be able to see them as well. Results are up.
And do you want to just run the second question at this point whilst you're at it?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, and reveal the answers, please, Chloe.
Yep.
Wow, that's a lot of work. that first option is a lot of work and interesting. That wasn't what I was expecting, to be honest. But, right, let's talk a bit about planning and how and actually transitioning the methodology, the approach you're going to adopt. Haseeb, for a bank, what are the key areas? What are the key work streams? Haseeb, and then perhaps Saranjan.
Yeah, so when we are talking to our clients, we tend to, kind of divide the transition effort into three main focus area. As you know, this is quite a complex process, but it helps to identify specific work stream while you're planning. One obviously is the exposure analysis, and I think within that, the absolute key is to be able to accurately identify what your LIBOR exposures are. For some of the big financial institutions, doing this manually is just next to impossible. So I think that's absolutely critical. And once you've done that, you have to then make sure that what you have captured, you are able to run some sort of an exposure analysis, because that will determine the amount of effort that you will have to put into the effort. Now, for large banks, you could potentially look at portfolio compression to reduce your LIBOR dependencies. But exposure identification and the exposure analysis is really the first thing that needs to be done. And then the other focus area is the documentation and the legal analysis, because once you've done this, as we've been saying, it's extremely important for that effort to have started already, approaching your counterparties and trying to make sure that they understand the need for the repapering and proactively trying to renegotiate the documents. And the third one is the systems and the IT infrastructure, because RFR is so very different from LIBOR. We have yet to talk to a financial institution or any one of our clients who actually told us that their existing systems are sufficient enough to be able to handle daily compounding that is required of the RFR. So these are the three areas. And Suranjan, do you want to elaborate a little bit on the systems and IT infrastructure?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you're looking at it from a technology perspective, again, the technology perspective is primarily driven by the overall transformation program. And as Steve mentioned earlier, moving away from any of the IBORs is, effectively a multidisciplinary transformation program. So starting all the way, as you mentioned, Hasib, from looking at the current exposure, looking at your contracts, but then also understanding the qualitative and the quantitative impact of the change. And to do that, again, you need significant IT changes for that to happen. The quantitative side obviously is relatively simple to understand. You have to put in, compatibility with the new data structures so that you can revalue and reprice everything that you have. From a qualitative perspective, again, I think Ash kind of had picked it up earlier on around, and it was part of the poll as well, whether, are you going to bilaterally negotiate now? Are you going to go into the fallbacks? Now, that itself also, if you think about, each bank having hundreds and thousands of clients and counterparties out there, that itself also is almost like a CRM activity that you can kind of carry on for quite a while before you actually get to the end state. So again, that could be a proper process which could be driven through CRM type solutions and systems. And I think the other element around systems here or technology here is, again, managing and maintaining the expectations of the key stakeholders, including the regulators. So in order to be able to do that, I think each IBOR discontinuance program needs to be managed as a set of metrics and measures across all these areas that we've just mentioned, so that tomorrow when the regulator comes back and kind of sends you another dear CEO letter, you're actually able to kind of respond to the regulator and say, hey, this is what our IBOR discontinuance program looks like. This is where we are. And if you look at the dashboard at a C level, we can show exactly how we're progressing. So there's a lot of things, a lot of places where technology can play a role, and of course the obvious ones around OCR and recognizing contracts and so on. But yeah, I mean, that's my tuppence on that.
Sorry, thank you. Just to add, just to add one point here, because to the regulators in the UK, US, and Europe obviously are integral part of the discussion, but we've also seen is that the regulators in emerging markets are also quite actively talking to the financial institutions, because from their perspective, it is absolutely critical to make sure that the banks are and the financial institutions are ready. They are prepared, they have systems in place, they know how to actually go about to transition. So I think from central, and we are talking to quite a few central banks also, both from the perspective of their own exposures to LIBOR, but also from the perspective of helping them how to make sure that the health of their own local financial market is maintained.
Yeah, look, good. So whilst we're on that, yeah, I mean, we've spoken a lot about UK and US regulators and regulated, you know, institutions on those markets. Let's just move away. You know, there's a lot of banks, including some on this call, who are not in the EU, who are smaller. They don't have these massive, great IT infrastructures in the same way as some of the global investment banks and so on. You've obviously been talking to some of those guys as well. I think Ash as well. If you want to just share, even just to sort of, you know, what an appropriate level of preparation at this stage is right for them. I think that would be useful if you could share that.
Yes, so when we started talking to our clients in the emerging markets, invariably the first reaction that we received is that, you know, listen, we don't have a lot of exposure to LIBOR. We are not like the big European and the US banks. So that is true, right? I mean, if you look at Africa, Middle East is slightly different, because in Middle East, the currency is pegged to dollars, so they end up having quite a significant LIBOR exposure. But in other parts of the world, you know, they're relatively small exposure. And the consequence of that, obviously, is the fact that their risk analysis effort does not have to be as detailed and as involved as some of the larger banks. Having said that, you know, what I have been telling to my clients is that even if you have one loan, for example, which is on a floating rate basis, you still have to make sure that the systems are ready. Unless you decide today that from now onwards, you are not going to issue any floating rate loan. And even if you forget about the legacy contract, you still have to make sure that the systems are absolutely ready to be able to book and accrue the RFR linked loan. So that is important. Plus their, you know, their obligation towards their clients is still there. They have to reach out to their clients, make sure that the clients do understand what is happening. So for example, in one country, you know, I can name it, in Pakistan, there is a large exposure to LIBOR, to the corporates and to the financial institutions. Not relatively as large as from some of the banks in the Middle East and obviously Europe and US, but they still have to go through the process. They still have to make sure that the systems are ready. They're still talking to their clients. The repapering has to be done. So this is something that cannot be completely ignored and wait for the secession to happen. There has to be some level of proactive approach, even the smaller banks have to make sure that they undertake. Guy.
Ash, anything you want to add from conversations you've been having?
Yeah, just one last thing. So some of the clients that we've been speaking to in Middle East and Africa, some of their responses were around, you know, the counterparty on the other side is a US or European bank, and you know they are doing everything that they can do. And for those situations, our view and our advice to our client has been that, you know, even if the counterparty is working on some kind of a, you know, fallback negotiation or a spread negotiation with you, you should be very mindful of what is the economic impact of whatever that negotiation is going to be like. And this negotiation may or may not be completely in your favor. So that is something that people need to keep in mind. And as Steve already mentioned, some of the banks have started to work on syndicated transactions, which are now RFR linked. If you want to be a part of that, you need to have those systems. Otherwise, that will be a lost opportunity.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll move on a little bit to talk about, so obviously, as Steve mentioned, there's some problems here. Just much of this is just about the legacy book. Some of it's about, you know, just printing new products going forwards, even if you have no legacy book. But focusing on that legacy book, because there has been a lot of talk about it, both Bank of England working group, hence the legislative solution. Stephen, Do you want to tell us what people who are approaching repapering, how they're going about it, how they're organising themselves, based on discussions you've been having?
Sure. So in the majority of cases, I think clients are in a relatively similar place in terms of where they are in the process. The first step that most folks have gone down is trying to get a grip on exactly how big of a challenge this is, what the size of the problem is, how costly this could end up being, and to that end, they undergo a discovery phase. So trying to understand which components of the organization have documents that are affected, how deeply they're affected, do any fallbacks exist within the current documentation? Are clients going to want to trade out of documents instead of having to force repapering upon them, etc.? And trying to understand all the mechanics within that those documents. And within that phase, I think there's the discussion, which the second poll question comes to. So how do you find out exactly what the contracts contain? So is AI, is OCR tools going to help you? I think the answer that we saw with a high level of manual review is pragmatic. I think it can be helped and assisted with some OCR. I'm not certain that AI is necessarily up to speed in the space to be able to deal with a number of bespoke contracts, but definitely OCR and then manual reviewing from a quality perspective is useful. That then leads into an analysis phase of we understand the portfolio, we understand the scale of the problem, we know which departments, which stakeholders within the organization are involved, we know who's involved externally, and from that point we can piece together a project team, a program to go through the remediation of the contracts and to understand the cost of what that really means to the organization. So there is a pretty complicated analysis phase on the back end of this, and I think what everyone has said on the call today has given a picture of some of the complexities of that analysis. And once the analysis phase is complete, we would then move to template creation to try and help with the renegotiating process and write that playbook. But in most cases, we're not there because of some of the lack of clarity, some of the lack of liquidity, some of the challenges with migrating. So most clients are at the discovery or analysis phase of the project, of the program. And I think there's still significant work that needs to be done before we can move into a full-blown repapering and execution stage for most of the projects.
Yeah, Saranjan, well, Stephen spoke a bit about some of the tools that people are using. Have you got anything to add on that?
Yeah, and I think this is where our partnership with Fieldfisher, and especially one of the Fieldfisher's tools, the Condor platform, as well as Hitachi's content platform together, can accelerate this journey significantly. OCR and a combination of OCR and AI to an extent. Now we can't kind of use it, we can't use AI kind of as a blanket tool to kind of make everything happen magically. But I think there's a certain level of information that we could, we could receive from from the documents in an accelerated way with a certain level of confidence. So not everything is going to be 100% based on AI, but there's a certain level of confidence that we can apply to the information harnessed from the documents, and that could potentially accelerate the process. And of course, with the Hitachi content platform and Condor, I think that gives you a nice management and mechanism to kind of to put a process around this whole thing in a much more structured way, and I think that's eventually going to help a large number of organizations who are using this or any other similar platform in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. You mentioned the fact, obviously, there's some challenges around taking things into, if you like, the final phase or third phase you mentioned, simply because in some markets of product we don't have the standards yet to apply. But what other kind of consistent challenges or obstacles are clients seeing to mobilizing a repapering project at this time?
I think there are a number of challenges. Most of the challenges, or the biggest challenge, I think, is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So there's nothing you could buy off a shelf that would solve the problem. There's no magic panacea, which I think most people expect and understand because portfolios are unique and generally different. And and the way that the contracts were initially written could have differed significantly from organization to organization. So I think that's one of the key challenges. I think some of the other challenges are generally, dealing with multiple providers. We've spoken about the challenges of some legal complexities in the UK market. We've spoken about legal complexities in non-UK markets, specifically in Asia, which seems to be lagging a little bit for various reasons. Then there's dealing with quantitative analysis, systems folks, risk analysis. There's this concept of dealing with your documentation with AI, with OCR tools. There's bringing additional resources in to help manage this. And I think clients are looking at this and seeing that this is a large scale project that requires multiple vendors and multiple providers. And contracting with all of them is pretty complex. But what you want to do is you want to try and complex with one party that can try and manage the entire end to end. And in a lot of cases, that's not that straightforward. I think there's the partnership that's been discussed, and we try and bring together a solution to cover that. But dealing with multiple providers, multiple legal teams, multiple stakeholders is always a challenge. One of the things that just kind of bringing the two questions together, one of the interesting conversations that we have with clients is around technology, and we talk about some of the really sexy tech tools that we can, feel can bring some benefit. But the majority of clients aren't actually interested in the really super duper high tech stuff. They're interested in project management tools that can give me a dashboard and show me where I am in this process. And when I'm asked, what the next step is in this particular transition, or what next I need to report up, we've had another Dear CEO letter. We need to know our exact status on these things. Just a dashboard that shows clients, this is where we are, this is what we're working on, this is the next step, this is a workflow solution. Some really simple some pieces of technology that we can put together for clients seem to have the biggest benefit. And I find that really quite interesting, that it's the project management tools, the graphical display, the dashboarding that really piques client interest, and less so the kind of overly powerful tech solutions that some folks are looking at. So.
Interesting. Chloe, do you want to run the last poll question before we move on to questions?
That's just on everyone's screen now.
Yep, I can see it. Just give it a few more seconds and then you can reveal. When you're ready, Chloe.
Results up now.
I'll just go to a look. Yeah, it's quite interesting that obviously I think that's probably where, based on what Hasib and Ash and others have said, there's a lot of people still can't get much beyond the first phase, or but it is also quite interesting that the next highest is those that think they've nailed it all. And actually we have spoken to a number of clients and they are really quite advanced. Some of the, it's mainly a bank thing, it's certainly not all of them, but it's one or two of them are very confident that they are exactly where they want to be, and they could start printing RFR loans, new products as required from just after the summer. We'll wait to see if that actually happens. It's an easy thing to say. It doesn't necessarily mean you're actually doing it, but we'll see. But thank you, Chloe. We can go back to briefly. We're going to run out of time, but I can't see the questions from the audience. We will respond to everyone who's put them in, even if we don't get the chance to talk to them. But Hasib, was there any that you've spotted that would be in the remaining moments or minutes?
I think there was one on the the implication for the risk for the treasury function and also financial reporting, Guy. And I think that is a question that we have covered quite extensively, that for the treasury teams who are responsible for hedges and the derivatives, it's extremely important for them to make sure that the transition is done more on a proactive basis to to conserve the economics, and also on the financial reporting. I think this is a question more for the accountants, but in some situations the hedge accounting could be could be significant implication, and therefore it is important that the accountants are engaged fairly on. But apart from that, Guy, if anybody wants to reach out to us for specific
yeah, rather than us overrun, if anyone wants to submit a question, please, you can do it in this if you stay on for a few seconds and send it in, and we will get back to you, we promise. Or just send any of us an email. We're easy enough to find. And thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.